If you're interested in health or longevity, I genuinely believe this is one of the most important videos you'll ever watch. Every week there's some new study that comes out that something either causes disease or prevents it. One week eggs are the perfect nutrient dense food and the next week they're killing you. Red wine's good for your heart and the next week alcohol's causing cancer. And just recently a new study came out linking melatonin to heart failure and headlines went crazy.
The new study has now linked regular melatonin use with the increased risk of heart failure.
A study that found that people who use melatonin long-term may face a higher risk of heart failure.
But here's the problem, most people never actually read the study, they read the headline. And the more shocking the headline is, the more likely it is to be published and shared. And the result is a huge amount of misinformation that leaves the public completely confused about what is healthy and what isn't. So let's systematically go through this melatonin study point by point and let me explain to you where all the errors are. The first thing you need to understand about this study is that it hasn't actually been through the full peer-reviewed process. What's circulating online isn't a fully published paper, it's an abstract that was presented at the American Heart Association scientific session in 2025. Now, this doesn't automatically mean the research is wrong, but abstracts are very early pieces of research and they often undergo significant changes before a full paper is published, if it's published at all. So, before drawing any major conclusions from the study, we need to be very careful about what it shows. So what did the researchers do? They used a large medical database called TriNetX, which contains electronic health records from hospitals around the world. Then they looked at adults who were diagnosed with chronic insomnia and divided them into two groups. One was people who were taking melatonin long-term with a prescription, and the other were people with insomnia who weren't necessarily taking melatonin. And after matching these patients for various things like age, medical conditions, medications, and other health factors, they had around 65,000 patients in each group. And then they followed these patients for 5 years and tracked certain outcomes. And according to the research, people who took the melatonin had about 89% higher risk of heart failure, 3 times the risk of heart failure hospitalizations, and 2 times the overall mortality. Now, when you see numbers like this, it should already be triggering some alarm bells because mechanistically, a natural supplement causing this much harm doesn't really make logical sense. And therefore, when you look deeper into the methodology, some obvious problems start to appear. The very first question you need to ask is what type of study this is. And it's important because there's various levels to research. Now, this specifically is an observational study, and more specifically, a retrospective cohort study. Now, inherently, there's nothing wrong with these studies, but they're observational. And so they generate these hypotheses that we can then prove with an experimental study. In other words, they can tell us that two things are correlated with each other, but they cannot necessarily prove definitively that one thing caused the other thing. But why not? The reason is because in observational research, the investigations aren't controlling the exposure. They're simply observing what's happening in the real world. And this introduces one of the biggest limitations of epidemiology, something we call confounding. Now, confounding is when there's a third factor that influences both your exposure and your outcomes. And so even if these two things are associated with each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. Now, to be fair, the researchers did try to account for this using something we call propensity score matching, but methods like this are never perfect and residual confounding always exists. Now, let me try to explain what confounding is using this specific study as an example. Who do you think is more likely to be prescribed melatonin? Well, obviously it goes without saying that someone whose insomnia is bad enough that they require what in some countries is a prescription medication. But here's the key point. Poor sleep in itself is associated with worse cardiovascular outcomes. For example, there was this study linking short sleep duration and chronic sleep disturbance with an increased risk of heart failure. And here also is a meta-analysis of observational and Mendelian randomization studies providing strong evidence supporting a causal association between insomnia and CVD risk. Now, to be completely transparent, some of the studies that I just showed you are also observational, so it doesn't prove cause and effect either. but it highlights an important point. And that is that sleep itself is strongly linked to cardiovascular health, which means that the association seen in the original paper may have very little to do with melatonin at all. And that brings me to another limitation in studies like this, something we call reverse causation. So in this study, the assumption is that melatonin use is causing heart failure. But what if it's the other way around? What if it's the heart failure that's resulting in increased melatonin use? Now, let me explain why that idea may not be as absurd as it initially sounds. In heart failure, the heart struggles to pump blood forward effectively. And when that happens, the blood backs up into your lungs, kind of like a traffic jam. And this causes people to become short of breath because there's so much fluid in the lungs. And importantly, that shortness of breath often gets worse when people are lying flat, what we call orthopnea. So people with heart failure frequently struggle to sleep because breathing gets worse when they lie down. And what do people do when they develop poor sleep? They reach for sleeping aids, including melatonin. So it's entirely possible that some patients in this study were already developing heart failure, which disrupted their sleep, and that worsening sleep then led them to start taking melatonin. In that situation, melatonin isn't causing heart failure. Worsening heart failure is causing them to reach for the melatonin. Now, that's only some of the limitations of the study. There's others as well. For example, misclassification bias. Since melatonin is only available over the counter in many countries, some people taking melatonin may have been incorrectly placed in the control group. And at this point in the video, it's natural to feel a little bit overwhelmed. You might be wondering who you're supposed to trust, and is all research just garbage? And that brings me to the next question. If we really wanted to test whether melatonin causes heart failure, what would the ideal study look like? What kind of study can demonstrate cause and effect? Well, let me introduce you to something called the randomized control trial. In a randomized control trial, we also assign people to two groups, and we try to make those groups as similar as possible, except for one thing. One group receives the melatonin, the other group does not. And very importantly, who receives the melatonin is decided completely at random. And that randomization is important because it helps minimize the bias and confounding that we just talked about. Once those groups are assigned, we simply follow them over a set period of time. And interestingly, we have data from randomized control trials on this very topic. Here is a meta-analysis of randomized control trials, meaning the researchers pooled together results from multiple studies where patients were randomly assigned to receive melatonin or not. And what did they find? Well, in patients with heart failure, melatonin was associated with improvements in several clinical measures. There was a trend towards improving ejection fraction, which is a measure of the heart's pumping ability, although this did not reach statistical significance. And furthermore, the studies found improvements in quality of life, sleep quality, appetite, and endothelial function. And based on these findings, the authors concluded that melatonin may even have potential as a therapeutic option for people with heart failure. Ultimately, this melatonin study is the perfect example of why we need to look beyond the headlines and critically evaluate the science. And in the age of information overload, learning how to correctly interpret science may be one of the most important health skills you can have. And that is why you need to subscribe to my channel and check out this video over here where I discuss a keto LDL study that proves the exact opposite of what the authors intended to show.